The roar of 80,000 people was a living thing, a tidal wave of sound that pulsed and shook the steel bones of Wembley Stadium. Lights shot out like white fire across the night, sweeping through the dark, reaching every corner of the sea of humanity. The stage was a glowing island in the storm, and at its center stood Freddie Mercury, chest bare under his iconic white tank top, crownless yet every inch a king, microphone stand gripped like a scepter. Sweat gleamed on his brow, his dark eyes alive with that wicked spark that could flip between playful mischief and regal command in the space of a heartbeat. The band had just blasted through the final notes of Radio Ga. The crowd's clapping still thundered in rhythm, tens of thousands of hands slapping air in perfect unison. Freddie paced the lip of the stage, smiling like a man who had already conquered the world but still craved the next battle. He was at the height of his power, his voice having soared above pyrotechnics and guitar firestorms, commanding attention the way few men in history ever had. Then it happened. Out of the dark ocean of faces, a single object cut across the gulf between audience and star. It wasn't beer or a plastic cup, as so often rained down at lesser shows. No, this was something delicate, absurdly fragile against the immensity of the moment. A rose. The flower sailed to the hot stage lights, its crimson petals glowing almost blood-red as it spun in slow motion. Time itself seemed to hitch. Every eye in the first rose followed its trajectory. For a heartbeat, the stadium was not 80,000 screaming people. It was a single breath waiting to see where the rose would fall. It landed at Freddie's feet. He stopped moving. His boots froze inches from it, and the band, without realizing, faltered, their final lingering notes bending strangely as Brian May's fingers hovered uncertainly over his guitar strings. Roger Taylor sticks paws midair. The crash cymbals echoed, dying like a wave pulling back from the shore. The sudden break in momentum sliced the atmosphere. A hush rippled forward through the crowd. Freddie bent at the waist, his lithe body folding like a dancer, and plucked the rose from the stage floor. Slowly, deliberately, the way a priest might lift a relic. The stadium's silence thickened. This wasn't planned. It wasn't part of the show. Every person there could feel it. The fabric of performance had just been torn open, and they were all staring at the raw seam. Freddie straightened, holding the flower in one hand. The stem caught delicately between his fingers. The petals quivered, their fragile edges trembling in the heat rising off the lights. He stared at it with an expression that no one in the audience expected. Not a grin, not one of his smirking, theatrical flourishes, but something softer, pensive, vulnerable, even. For a few long seconds, he said nothing. The silence was unbearable. Thousands of fans who had been screaming themselves hoarse a moment ago were now breathless, afraid that the slightest noise would shatter the strange spell tightening around the arena. And then the grin returned. Freddie raised the rose high into the air, twirling it between his fingers, and the crowd exploded as though an invisible dam had burst. A roar, louder than before, surged across Wembley. Some cheered, some laughed, some cried out with relief. But no one, not a single soul, looked away. Who's the romantic, then? Freddie's voice carried, rich and teasing, through the microphone. He held the rose aloft like it was both a joke and a crown jewel. Which one of you dared interrupt Her Majesty's concert with a flower? The crowd howled. In the middle tiers, fans shoved, craning to see if someone would confess. Spotlights swirled over faces, catching sequins, painted cheeks, shirts soaked with sweat and rain. But nobody owned up. Freddie pressed a rose to his chest and staggered backward, mock dramatic, his knees buckling. "Oh, darling, you've slain me," he cried, collapsing onto the stage in a pantomime faint. The audience erupted in laughter, shrieking and clapping. He rolled onto his back, holding the rose high, letting its shadow fall across his face as if he were a knight struck down in battle. Brian May strummed a few playful notes, a makeshift funeral dirge, while Roger gave a drum roll. The gag threatened to stay just that, a moment of Freddie's showmanship, another playful improvisation among thousands. But then something shifted. Freddie sat up slowly, the laughter still ringing, and looked at the rose again. This time his grin faded. He turned it in his hands, studying it, the fragile petals, the green stem with its tiny thorns, the way it seemed absurdly out of place amid smoke, sweat, and floodlights. His expression softened. The laughter died down. Freddie raised his eyes, scanning the stadium. For the first time that night, he looked less like a rock god and more like a man searching for something. The silence returned, thicker now, not playful, but heavy. The entire stadium leaned forward, as though they might hear his thoughts if they stayed still enough. Finally, he brought the rose to his lips. He kissed it gently. A simple act, but charged with electricity. A scream of devotion ripped from somewhere in the back rows, followed by a wave of voices chanting his name. Freddie! 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 The stadium pulsed with it. Tens of thousands of voices in perfect rhythm, chanting, demanding, begging him to transform the moment into something unforgettable. Freddie rose to his feet, holding the rose against his microphone stand. He planted it there carefully, like a flag marking new territory. Then, with a sudden burst of fire, he shouted into the mic. "This," he pointed to the rose, "is why I love you, darlings, because you give me life." The crowd detonated. Drums thundered. Guitar strings snapped back into fury. The stadium came alive again, louder than ever, yet different now, because every single person there knew that something had shifted. The night wasn't just another Queen concert anymore. A rose had fallen. Freddie had caught it, and from that moment on, the entire show belonged to legend. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to support the channel. For a while, the music thundered again, the band charging into the next riff as if nothing unusual had happened. Brian's guitar cut through the night, Roger pounded the drums like artillery, and John Deacon's bass throbbed steady beneath it all. But even with a familiar hurricane of sound, the audience wasn't the same. Something about that single rose and Freddie's kiss had shifted the air inside Wembley. The crowd wasn't just hearing Queen anymore. They were hanging on Freddie's every breath, waiting for him to do something with a fragile gift still pinned to his microphone stand. Freddie knew it too. As the final chorus Somebody to Love echoed into the night, he let the silence linger again, stretching it thin. He reached for the rose, plucked it delicately from the mic stand, and held it up to the crowd. The petals glowed under the lights, crimson fire against the sweat on his fingertips. "Do you know what this is, my darlings?" he asked, his voice carrying that teasing lilt. "It's a bloody interruption. That's what it is." The audience roared with laughter, relieved at the humor. But Freddie's expression softened almost instantly. He looked down at the rose, twirling it slowly, his eyes narrowing as if the flower were whispering secrets no one else could hear. He pressed it to his lips again, not playful this time, but thoughtful, reverent. When he looked back up, his voice was lower, quieter, but somehow more commanding. "But it's also something else, isn't it?" he continued. "It's fragile. It's beautiful. It's fleeting." The crowd quieted. The stadium of tens of thousands, so loud a moment ago, bent toward him like children gathered at a storyteller's knee. "Look at it," Freddie said, holding the rose out at arm's length. "This little thing survived the crush of 80,000 people, the madness of the night, and still managed to find its way up here, right to me." He paused, staring at the rose, then at the crowd. His eyes glistened under the lights. "Don't you see? That's all of us, isn't it? Fragile, beautiful, trying to survive the madness." The audience erupted in cheers, but they weren't wild anymore. They were soulful, heavy with feeling. People began to raise their lighters, tiny flames flickering against the darkness, like stars blooming into existence. A wave of them spread through the crowd, until Wembley glowed like a galaxy under the night sky. Freddie stood still, drinking it in. His chest rose and fell. For once, he wasn't strutting, wasn't teasing, wasn't even performing in the usual sense. He was simply standing there, a man with a rose in his hand, connected to 80,000 hearts beating as one. He cleared his throat, his voice breaking just slightly. "Do you know what I've learned, my darlings?" He raised the rose higher. "Love doesn't come in bouquets. It doesn't come in armfuls of flowers. Sometimes it's just one rose." The crowd exploded in applause, but Freddie's gaze had turned inward. Those closest to the stage saw it. The flicker of something raw in his eyes. A private storm beneath the stage lights. Because for Freddie, the rose wasn't just a flower. It was a reminder. A reminder of Mary Austin, the woman who had once been his great love, who still remained his closest confidant. A reminder of Jim Hutton, sitting quietly at the edge of the chaos, the steady hand in his whirlwind life. A reminder of every fan who had ever reached out to him with trembling hands, offering not just adoration, but pieces of themselves. The Rose was all of them. And Freddie, who had built his career on flamboyance, spectacle, and bravado, suddenly found himself bearing a tenderness he rarely allowed anyone to see. He paced slowly, the rose still in his hand. "You give me this," he said, his voice stronger now, gesture with the flower. "And I give you this." He spread his arms wide, motioning the stage, the band, the lights, his whole being. "We keep each other alive, don't we? You and me. Always." The chant began again, rhythmic, unstoppable. "Freddie, Freddie, Freddie." Freddie smiled, but it was softer this time, tinged with something almost melancholy. He shook his head, pressing the rose against his heart. "Don't you dare stop chanting," he said into the mic, his grin returning. "Because I need it, my darlings. I need it more than you know." The honesty in his voice hit the crowd like a wave. People were crying now, real tears streaking through painted cheeks, mascara running. Strangers clutching each other as if they had just been told a secret that bound them all together. And then, as if sensing the emotional peak had to break before it collapsed under its own weight, Freddie's playful spark returned. He twirled the rose like a baton and held it out toward Brian May. "Go on, Bree," he teased. "Write us a bloody love song about this, will you?" Brian strummed a warm chord, smiling faintly, shaking his head. The crowd laughed. Tension released, but the feeling lingered. Something had shifted between performer and audience. They weren't just watching a show. They were inside a communion. Freddie turned back to the microphone, slipping the rose back onto the stand. He leaned close, his lips almost brushing the petals. His voice dropped to a whisper, but carried through every speaker, every heart. "Whoever you are," he said softly, almost to himself, "thank you." And then, boom, Roger's sticks came down, Brian's guitar screamed, and the stadium jolted back into motion. But the energy wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't just excitement, wasn't just adrenaline. It was reverence. Every note that followed was colored by that single fragile gesture. And deep down, everyone knew the concert had crossed into something timeless. The music surged back, the band charging to the next number with renewed fire. But the audience wasn't the same. Something had changed since the rose had fallen, since Freddie had held it like a relic and whispered his thanks. Every eye, every heart was fixed on that single flower pinned to his mic stand. It wasn't just part of the show anymore. It was the show. Freddie knew it, and he wasn't about to let the moment slip away. As the final chorus of Crazy Little Thing called Love echoed through the stadium, he gripped the mic with one hand and the rose with the other. With a dramatic flourish, he ripped the flower from the stand and strutted across the stage like a catwalk model, the petals glowing crimson under the spotlights. "Now then," he purred into the microphone, his accent rolling like velvet thunder. "Who among you is bold enough to admit this little crime of passion?" The crowd shrieked with laughter and applause. Freddie held the rose out like an accusation, pointing it into the sea of faces. "Come on, darling," he called, his voice teasing, but charged with challenge. "Don't be shy. You've stopped the Queen show in its tracks. That's no small feat. Show yourself." The cameras swung over the audience, magnifying faces onto the giant screens. Girls covered their mouths. Boys whistled. Friends pointed at one another, accusing and laughing. The stadium pulsed with nervous energy, every person suddenly terrified and thrilled by the thought Freddie Mercury might single them out. Freddie stalked the stage, prowling from side to side, holding the rose high. "I won't continue until you confess," he warned, mock serious. 80,000 people waiting, and it all comes down to you. A cheer erupted from somewhere in the middle tiers. Spotlight shot toward it, catching a young woman in her early 20s, small and trembling, her face lit with both terror and disbelief. In her hand, a friend waved a crumpled stem, proof of roses they brought with them. The crowd exploded. "There!" Freddie shouted, pointing with exaggerated triumph. Our culprit has been revealed. A Rose assassin in the third tier. The stadium howled. Chants building. The girl covered her face, shaking her head, but the spotlight held her fast. Her friends shoved her forward, urging her to wave. Freddie pressed a hand to his heart. Darling, do you know what you've done? You've hijacked my show. The girl, still trembling, mouthed something the cameras couldn't catch. Freddie cocked his head, then leaned toward the mic, grinning. She says she only wanted me to have it. The words rippled through the crowd like a current. The laughter softened into something warmer, more tender. Freddie's grin shifted into a smirk. Well, you nearly gave me a bloody heart attack, he teased. But since you've dared, I suppose I should reward you. The band, sensing the improvisation, quieted to a gentle hum. Brian plucked a few soft chords, Roger tapping lightly at the snare. Freddie lowered himself to the stage floor, cross-legged, the rose still in hand, as if about to tell a bedtime story to 80,000 children. Do you know, he began, his tone quieter now, how many times I've wished for someone to just throw me truth instead of bras, knickers, or beer cans? The audience laughed, clapped, but then hushed as his voice dropped even lower. This rose, it's simple. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It just is. He held it up, spinning it slowly between his fingers. And you, my dear in the third tier, you've reminded me tonight that sometimes the smallest gesture speaks the loudest. The girl's face appeared on the Jumbotron, tears streaking down her cheeks. The crowd cheered wildly. Thousands of strangers suddenly invested in her private moment with Freddie Mercury. Freddie sprang to his feet, energy snapping back. He pointed the rose at her like a sword. Stand up, darling, he commanded. You've started something and now you're part of it. The girl rose, shaking, her friend steadying her. The spotlight blazed on her as 80,000 people turned, clapped, shouted her name though they didn't know it. Ladies and gentlemen, Freddie bellowed, raising the rose high, our guest of honor. The crowd erupted, stomping, chanting, laughing, crying. The girl covered her face, overwhelmed, but Freddie wasn't done. He turned back to the band. Right then, boys, he called, let's give her a song she'll never forget. Brian strummed a familiar progression. Roger's sticks clicked into rhythm. The first notes of Love of My Life floated into the night. The crowd screamed with recognition, then hushed. Freddie walked back to the mic, the rose pressed against his chest. He looked directly at the girl, then at the tens of thousands beyond her, and sang the opening lines of rawness that silenced the entire stadium. Love of my life, you've hurt me. The words cut through the air, sharp and tender all at once. The rose seemed to vibrate in his hand, every note infusing it with meaning. The girl in the third tier sobbed openly, her face magnified on the screens. And yet, it wasn't just her anymore. It was everyone. The rose wasn't hers alone. It belonged to the crowd, to Freddie, to the night itself. By the second chorus, the audience had joined in, their voices rising, fragile yet mighty, 80,000 strong. Freddie stopped singing altogether, holding the mic out, and listened as the stadium carried the song without him. He lowered his head, clutching the rose against his heart. His lips moved silently. Thank you. For a man who had made his life out of spectacle, this moment of surrender was more powerful than any light show, any firework, any costume change. The rose had stripped the night bare, revealing only Freddie, the crowd, and the music that bound them together. When the song ended, he lifted the rose again, kissed it, and pointed it back toward the girl in the stands. That, my darling, he said, his voice warm and thick with emotion, is your gift to me. And this, he swept his arm across the entire stadium, is my gift to you. The crowd thundered, people hugging, crying, screaming. And Freddie, grinning now with that familiar spark, twirled a rose like a baton again and declared, now let's bloody rock this place in the ground. The band exploded into the next anthem, lights blazing, drums pounding. But nothing could erase the softness that lingered in the air. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something unscripted, intimate, unforgettable. A single rose, a single fan, and Freddie Mercury's choice to make her, and all of them, part of the story. The stadium still vibrated with the echo of Love of My Life. Freddie had just turned the mic outward, letting the crowd's voices soar into the night sky. 80,000 strangers had become one voice, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as though Wembley itself were alive, humming with something far greater than a concert. But Freddie wasn't finished. He held the rose against his chest again, bowing slightly as if to acknowledge not just the girl who had thrown it, but the thousands who had sung with him. Then, with a sudden burst of mischief, he twirled it between his fingers and tucked it behind his ear like a flamenco dancer. The crowd erupted in laughter and cheers, but Freddie's grin suggested he had another trick hidden behind it. "Now," he purred into the microphone, prowling across the stage, "this rose has had its moment, hasn't it? But what's the point of a gift if you don't share it?" The audience leaned forward, sensing the shift. Freddie stopped at the edge of the stage, crouching down, rose in hand. His eyes scanned the front rows, hands reaching, fans screaming, bodies pressing against the barrier like waves against a cliff. "Shall I?" he teased, holding the rose just out of reach. "Shall I give it back to you, my darlings?" The screams were deafening. Thousands of arms shot into the air, desperate, pleading. But Freddie shook his head, laughing. No, not like this. I'm not going to toss it back into the madness. That's too easy. This rose deserves better." He stood again, turning toward Brian and Roger. "Boys," he said, voice dripping with theater, "give me something gentle, something the world can remember." Brian began to strum soft, improvised chords, not a full song, but something delicate, almost Spanish in flavor. Roger brushed the cymbals with his sticks, creating a shimmering backdrop. The stadium, moments ago a roaring beast, quieted into a hush. Freddie raised a rose to his lips, eyes closing as if he were about to kiss it again. But instead he began to sing. Not one of Queen's great anthems. Not even one of his famous ballads. Something entirely improvised, fragile and fleeting, born in the moment. A single rose found its way to me, in the middle of the madness, in the roar of Wembley. The crowd gasped, then silenced themselves, afraid to miss a note. Freddie paced slowly, the rose still in his hand, his voice weaving a melody that no one had ever heard before. His lyrics tumbled out raw and unpolished, but carried weight. He sang of love, of time, of fragility, the same themes he'd spoken a minute earlier, but now transformed into song. We are fragile, we are fleeting, but tonight, my darlings, we are meeting. In a single rose, in a single breath, we find our love, we cheat our death. The words floated into the night, imperfect yet perfect, carried on a voice that trembled with both power and vulnerability. Brian's guitar danced beneath it. Roger's brushes shimmered. John's bass pulsed like a heartbeat. And the audience? They were transfixed. People who had been screaming themselves hoarse now stood in stunned silence, tears streaming down their faces, hands pressed over mouths. Couples held one another tighter. Strangers linked arms. All because Freddie Mercury had taken a simple gesture, one rose, and spun it into something eternal. The camera panned again to the girl in the third tier, her face streaked with tears. She wasn't just a fan anymore. She was part of the legend being written in real time. Freddie, still singing, turned toward her image on the screen and raised a rose high. To you, my darling, who dared to throw the rose that made this moment grow. I thank you now, and I thank you twice, for reminding us that love is life. The improvised ballad ended not with a bang, but with a whisper. Freddie kissed the rose one last time and held out to crowd. Then, without hesitation, he leapt down. Security guards scrambled, panicked, but Freddie waved them off. He strode straight to the barrier, the rose still in his hand, sweat dripping down his chest. Fans screamed, surging forward, but he pointed to the young woman in the third tier. You, he said into the mic, his voice sharp and commanding. Come here. The stadium erupted in chaos. Ushers scrambled to help her down, pushing through the crowd as the spotlight followed. She was trembling, sobbing, her friends pushing her forward. The audience chanted, "Let her go, let her go," until finally she emerged near the stage. Freddie bent down, his arm outstretched. Their hands touched. her small, shaking fingers against his firm, warm grasp. He pulled her up with surprising strength, lifting her onto the stage like she belonged there. The stadium lost its mind. She stood frozen, trembling, tears streaking her cheeks, unable to look anywhere but at him. Freddie grinned, tilting his head, rose still in hand. "What's your name, darling?" he asked, voice gentle. Her whisper was caught by the mic, Anna. Freddie repeated it louder, rolling the name like music. "Anna!" The crowd echoed it, 80,000 voices chanting her name. He pressed the rose into her hands. "This belongs to you," he said softly. "But tonight, Anna, it belongs to all of us." The stadium shook with applause. Freddie pulled her into a brief, theatrical embrace, twirling her once before gently guiding her back toward the stage steps. Security helped her down, but not before the cameras caught her face, a mixture of shock, joy, and disbelief. Freddie turned back to the mic, sweat dripping, chest heaving. His eyes sparkled with mischief. "Well, my darlings," he said, grinning, "you've just witnessed the greatest duet of my career." The band exploded into Bohemian Rhapsody. Lights blazed, pyrotechnics roared, and the night surged back into full spectacle. But the energy was different now, because Freddie Mercury had broken the wall. He had pulled one of them onto the stage, turned her into part of the legend, and in doing so, reminded everyone at Wembley that the magic of a Queen concert wasn't just the music. It was the connection, and all it had taken was a single rose. Bohemian Rhapsody roared through Wembley like a storm breaking against stone. Spotlights fractured into colors, smoke cannons spat fire, and Freddie Mercury stood at the very center of it all, every movement of his body commanding not just attention, but worship. His white tank top clung to him with sweat, his eyes wild, his grin sharp as a blade. He was not just singing. He was summoning something vast and uncontrollable, channeling 80,000 souls into a single shared heartbeat. But tonight, there was something different woven into the thunder. It wasn't just the operatic crescendos, the guitar solos that rattled the night sky, or Freddie's impossible voice soaring to the heavens. It was a rose, pinned once more to his microphone stand. Its crimson petals wilted slightly in the heat of the stage lights. Yet somehow, under the glare and smoke, it looked immortal, as if it had been reforged into a symbol. The crowd wasn't just watching Freddie perform. They were watching him build a legend out of something fragile, something ordinary. When the final, "Nothing Really Matters," faded into the night, the crowd held their breath, unwilling to let go. Freddie looked down at the rose. For a long beat, he just stared at it, chest heaving, sweat dripping down his neck. Then he plucked it free again, raising it high above his head like a torch. "This," he shouted into the mic, his voice booming, echoing off the walls of Wembley, "is for every one of you, for the hearts that dare to throw love into the fire." The stadium erupted. Fireworks cracked overhead, showering sparks into the night. The crowd roared so loud it rattled the very earth. People waved their arms. Strangers clutched one another, tears streaming down faces painted with glitter and sweat. Freddie twirled the rose like a baton, then pressed it to his lips once more. He closed his eyes as if savoring its fragility. When he opened them again, there was no grin, only raw honesty. "You've given me this rose," he said, softer now, but every speaker carried it into the farthest corners of Wembley. "And in return, I give you myself. Every note, every scream, every ounce of me." He pounded his chest with his free hand, eyes blazing. "That's the deal. You give me one rose, I give you my bloody soul." The response was a roar so loud it became physical, slamming into the stage like a tidal wave. Freddie staggered back, laughing, overwhelmed by the sheer force of it. "All right then," he bellowed. "Let's finish this the way legends should." The band launched into "We Will Rock You." The stadium instantly stomped and clapped, the rhythm reverberating through the concrete, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Freddie raised the rose like a conductor's baton, slashing it through the air with each stomp, each clap, as if commanding an army. When the final chorus ended, Freddie didn't let the moment drop. He spun around, snapped back to Mike, and with one last surge, he screamed, "We are the champions." The crowd detonated. The anthem surged like a tidal wave, voices breaking, bodies swaying, arms raised. Freddie sang each line with the rose clenched in his fist, the petals shaking with every vibrato. When he hit the final "No Time for Losers," he thrust the rose high into the air, his entire body arching with it. The entire stadium seemed to hold its breath for the final note. And then he hurled the rose. The crimson flower cut through the lights once more, just as it had when it first landed on stage. This time, though, it wasn't fragile. It was legendary. 80,000 eyes followed it as it arced back into the sea of people. Hands shot up, desperate, clawing for it. When one caught it, just one, the crowd screamed as if the torch had been passed, as if they had witnessed coronation of a moment that would never die. Freddie collapsed to his knees, arms outstretched, chest heaving, soaking in the roar. His bandmates played the last lingering notes. Fireworks lit the sky. The night shook with thunder. And then silence. Freddie rose slowly, still catching his breath. He looked out across the endless sea of faces, his dark eyes scanning, his lips curling into a small, tired but deeply satisfied smile. He raised both arms wide, bowing low, soaking the waves of adoration that crashed over him. Before he left the stage, he leaned into the microphone one last time, voice quiet, almost intimate. "Remember this night," he whispered. "Remember the rose. Because tonight we made magic." The house lights rose. The band walked off, but the crowd didn't leave. They stayed, still chanting, still screaming, still holding on to the energy that refused to die. Some swore they could still see petals drifting in the air, glowing like embers. And long after the lights dimmed and the amplifiers cooled, the story spread. People told and retold it, sometimes exaggerating, sometimes simplifying, but always circling back to the same truth. On that night at Wembley, a single rose turned into something more. It became a legend. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.